Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. If you'd like to learn more about us and our many upcoming author events, please visit skylightbooks.com, where you can browse our inventory, buy books, and join our Friends with Benefits Club. You can also follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. To speak to a real live bookseller like me, please call 323-660-1175. Thanks for your support, and enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you, Skylight Books, for being here and supporting me all these years. And thank you all for supporting independent bookstores and being here to hear us talk about our new book. And
Shawna, thank you for actually helping edit my book.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it.
It was quite a chore, but it was a labor of love. His book is like 5 times the size of our book. So.
It was literally like, can you please help me because I'm sick of looking at this?
Everyone needs an editor. Writing is rewriting, as I tell my students. So we have a little slideshow to show you to tell the basic story of this club and of why we decided to put this book out. It's not so much the story of DC hardcore per se, but a story about a place in DC that meant a lot to a lot of bands and a lot of people. So, is this light gonna go off? Oh, yeah. Can we turn this light off? So that's the cover, as you know.
And who's on the cover? Russell's
this is a band called Underdog from New York, and this picture was taken in 1989, and that's Russell Iglay playing bass there. That's the cover shot. So the early days of DC hardcore have been pretty well documented in books and movies that you all may be familiar with. Banned in DC, I think, covers from 79 to 85. Dance of Days goes from, I think, the late 70s to 93, right after the development of Riot Grrrl. And in most of these, the story ends in 1985. So the people who were involved in early DC hardcore were a few years older than us, and by 1985, DC was experiencing their what they call Revolution Summer, and a lot of the bands were playing like more emo music at that time. But us coming up as the second generation, we kind of wanted our hardcore, our version of Minor Threat. So hardcore sort of experienced a rebirth in the late 80s, and that's basically what this book covers. And it covers bands like, we included some California bands in here, since we have the California audience. Insted they're from Orange County?
Yeah. Yes, they were.
Yes. This is them playing at Safari Club in 1989.
Yeah, from Fountain Valley, actually.
Fountain Valley. Yeah, so jump in with comments and questions as we go. I want this to be a discussion, and then we can get into a further discussion afterward. And Mike is, a music
nerd.
Yeah. You could say that. So I know you'll have a lot of information.
I'll take that. Okay.
Here. So that's Insted in 89 playing at the club. This is Unbroken. They're from San Diego. That's them in 95 playing there. And this is sort of how all of the hardcore shows began. I did not book this show. The Safari Club existed as an Ethiopian restaurant/disco before we started booking hardcore shows there. There were also go-go bands that played there on weekend nights. Go-go is a sort of pre-funk, drum-heavy music indigenous to DC. These are 3 local bands that were booked at the club: Swiz, Indian Summer, and Ulysses. That was Nation of Ulysses before they changed their name. I was dating the guitar player in Indian Summer at this time, and they booked this show, and we showed up to the club, and it turned out to be a pay-to-play situation. The owner wanted all the bands to pay $50 to the sound man before they could play. Swiz took off. Ulysses never showed up. Maybe they didn't even know that they were booked on the show. I don't know. In Indian Summer, they were a small new band from Northern California, and they were Northern Virginia. And they were sort of discussing whether they were going to pay to play. I mean, they'd come all this way, and it was their first show in DC proper. So they were deciding whether they're going to play or not. And in that discussion, in the confusion somehow, I thought they'd gone home to get some forgotten equipment, and I got left at the club. And I ended up, calling my boyfriend all night, getting the answering machine, calling my roommate Pam, No answer. And I ended up sitting at the club until 3 in the morning, talking to the club owner, chatting with the bartender, and asking what they were doing on the weekends during the day. Because I really wanted something like CBGBs. New York had CBGBs. They had all ages matinees on the weekends. And my friend Pam and I were going up to New York all the time for these shows, and we wanted something steady like that, all ages in DC. So by the end of the night, the owner said, okay, take a few dates in November, book some bands and see what you can do. And he also ran a cab company out of the back of the club. So he had one of his taxi drivers drive me home for free. I lived like 30 miles away, and the metro turns off at midnight. So I was 18, and so that's kind of the birth of the club. I went home and I was really excited to tell Pam that we had a place to book shows now, and I broke up with that boyfriend. So our first show, this is the beginning of my show log, my inappropriate quotation marks. I didn't know how to use those yet. But our first show was in November, and it was 3 local bands, not too many people, 69 people, but we were still stoked. Our second show was Gorilla Biscuits, Swiz, and it was supposed to be In Your Face from New York, but they canceled, and the club owner ended up booking Lucy Brown, who was a local DC band, and it was way bigger than we ever expected. 398 people paid to get in, so there were more than that because some people snuck in.
And this was a show where they were like 4 hours late.
They were also 4 hours late, and everyone waited for Gorilla Biscuits to show up because people were so desperate to see them. They had never played in DC before. This flyer on the left, someone else made for that show, I don't know who, and we made this flyer on the right. So that was sort of the beginning of everything. My friend Toby Morris, who I'd gone to high school with in Maryland, had recently moved to New York, and he was living with the Gorilla Biscuits guys, so he was the connector between us and a lot of the New York bands.
Wasn't there a picture of him?
It's coming up.
Okay.
This is an ad from the newspaper. There were always mistakes made because there was sort of a language barrier between us and the club owner, who was from Ethiopia. So this is pretty funny. The big Swiz Gorilla Biscuits In Your Face show was listed as Swiss Gorilla Biscuit In Your Face, both from New York. So there was always something wrong in the ads. And then this one, I think, it's Crucial Use, Screeching Weasel, The Blast played.
They had one called where it said Screaming Weasels.
Oh yeah, Screaming Weasels was listed instead of Screeching Weasel from Chicago. There were 3 different sets of promoters in this club's time period. This book covers the 10 years that it hosted hardcore shows. Me and my roommate and best friend Pam booked shows from 88 to 90, and then there was a guy named John Cornerstone who booked shows from 89 to 91. He had a record label and a fanzine as well. And then there were 3 promoters who booked shows in the later 90s. And sometime in those late 90s, the club's name changed from Safari to Chamber of Sound. And also Martin introduced Rich and I in 95. So there's a little love story in here. So he had come to all my shows, but I never met him until much later in 95. So we'd been in the same room hundreds of times before. So whenever we booked shows, our flyers always said No Scene Zine Presents, and that was sort of just an evolution out of our zine, No Scene Zine.
Why was it called No Scene Zine?
Because I grew up in southern Maryland in the middle of nowhere, and we had no scene. And I started it when I was 16 in high school. So you can see the things that were on my mind in the 80s. Here's a picture of Token Entry with Toby Morris, who now sings for H2O. And he was the one who connected us with a lot of those New York bands. This is him pre-tattoos, if any of you know him, what he looks like now. And that was Chuck, one of the bouncers.
We called him Big Chuck.
Big Chuck. There's some stories about him in the book. This is a band called In Your Face. And Toby's in the background there on the left, too. This is Absolution. They were also from New York. Gavin went on to start a band called Burn. And the second set of promoters, John Cornerstone and Carl Hedgepath.
Yep. Carl.
Yeah, so John had Cornerstone Productions. He put out Initial Reaction, local band.
Yep. local DC band. So this was like their era. They kind of picked up after you and Pam got fed up with Hailey, the owner.
Yeah, we had a lot of problems with the club owner. And we were teenagers. We didn't work with contracts. Everything was word of mouth and handshake. And once the owner saw that he could start making money off of shows, he demanded, more and more from the door, and things got really stressful and complicated, and we moved our last 2 shows to a club called the Barbecued Iguana. And then John sort of picked up from there. And then Pam was going to school, and I was going to school, and wrapped up in a stupid boyfriend, so I wasn't paying attention to shows anymore. This is another example of one of John's shows. Super Touch, Crack, they were from Baltimore. Agent 86. This is Initial Reaction.
Yep, that's one of John's shows. I guess they were from Virginia, like Northern Virginia, but they were local. They played a lot of the Safari Club shows.
Is Seth here? Seth Ford Young on the left there.
Yeah, he's an LA guy now.
Yeah. And this is when the club changed names to Chamber of Sound. They hosted a lot of hip-hop shows.
The club closed down for a few years after John stopped booking shows there.
Yeah.
And then it opened up later with different owners, and it was more like a hip-hop club. They also did go-go shows. And then our friend Martin used to go to the hip-hop shows there, and he knew the history of the Safari Club, so he kind of wanted to recreate that, started booking hardcore shows there again.
And as you can see, it wasn't much to look at. It was windowless, really hot. That roll-up gate was how bands loaded in and out. There was a door on the left. And at the time, DC in the 80s was not a very nice place. It was the murder capital of the world at the time. Our mayor was caught smoking crack. And this was in Chinatown, which it now is, of course, totally gentrified. But at the time, it was not the best neighborhood. A band called Bloodlet, played in the later years. Battery, DC band.
This was actually the show after me and Shawna met. Do you want to tell the story of
95.
like how Martin ran into you up against the wall at a clothing store?
It's not important.
You'll read about it in the book.
All right. I was working at a hip-hop clothing store, and Martin sort of unearthed me.
But after we reconnected, I told her, oh, they're doing shows at the Safari Club again, and you were surprised. You were like, I had no idea. And
Yeah.
then I said, you should come to a show, and this was the show that I brought you
Yeah,
to.
so he invited me to the show, and I was amazed that it looked similar to how it did in the 80s, but what was different was there were probably 50% of the audience was women, which was so different from when I was going to shows. There were maybe 5. And then also everyone had a camera, which in the 80s very few people did. So that was cool to see.
And Shelter, I don't know if you're familiar with that band, but their first show was at the Safari Club. They came down with Judge and just played a couple songs. And then a few years later, Better Than 1,000, Ray Capo's other band's first show was at the Safari Club. And they documented it with their t-shirt. And Martin, being into hip-hop, he started booking like rap shows.
So KRS-One played there.
Yeah.
And I think Tribe Called Quest was booked there, but he ended up moving that to a bigger venue. And these are just some flyers to show you some of the diversity of shows that were held there. The Toasters, also Ska Show. The Undead is Bobby Steele from the Misfits band, and Neurosis. You can also see it's sort of an evolution in design too. Like the early flyers are all the cut and paste punk style, and then graffiti style. That's Underdog, American Standard, and Fury. Those
The
are
guy
from
who
the
did
80s.
this flyer on the right did the cover
Yes,
logo.
Kyle Style. He was our resident graffiti artist, flyer maker, and then I guess people were using Quark and Illustrator.
Photoshop was invented.
Came around. Things got a lot more legible or boring, however you want to look at it. Josta 14 is Jamie from Hate Breeds.
I'm from Virginia Beach. I didn't know we had hardcore.
Oh, see? You had a scene. I love vegan food will be sold. This is a band called Immoral Discipline, a local DC band, but this is mostly just for reference to kind of show you where the stage was and that there was a disco ball that got kicked a lot when people were stage diving. And then this is what the club looked like later. It burned down in 1998 under some mysterious circumstances. There are a bunch of stories in the book. And Rich and I went back in 2012 and crawled under a fence to take these photos with a cop. He said it was okay.
We were escorted by a friend. But that's where the stage was, right there.
Yeah. So that's the end. That was the end of the club. And now it's, it was recently bought. I mean, it's just a facade that's left, and they're building condos on top of it. So.
And in 1981, I think it was the first PETA protest was out front because it used to be
It was a chicken market.
chicken market.
So it was the site of the first
factory.
PETA protest, which is documented in the Washington Post. Yes?
Can you talk about how you were able to get all these photos and flyers? Like, how hard was it to amass everything?
Yeah.
And who gave them to you? And did you have some yourself?
I kept some things, but not nearly enough for a book, and we really just relied on our community for that. We put the word out on Facebook and on websites, and people started sending us stuff. And then we worked on this for 6.5 years. It's been in the works. When we first started it, the Washington Post got wind of it. We'd put up a website, but we hadn't really announced it to anyone. And they wrote a story about the 30th anniversary of the Wilson Center, which is like a legendary community center that hosts a lot of punk shows. And in that story, they mentioned that we were working on a book. And then at first we thought it was just going to be a book for like 20 of our friends. And then when the Washington Post mentioned it, we got 1,000 emails in one day from people all over, and I was like, wow, I didn't know anyone was interested. So, and you can probably speak to that too with your book. You've probably had contributions from lots of people.
Yeah, I mean, well, my book is called Triple X Fanzine, 1983 to 88. And basically, I hate doing that. It's like, thank you.
Sing.
Okay. So, yeah, I know, but I'm not gonna like.
We can share.
So, yeah, I mean, basically, it was a zine I did that was run out of the Boston area, and it definitely had some sort of prominence in the hardcore scene. And what I thought was actually very interesting about it was it was sort of very much of a second generation fanzine. It sort of documented, by the time I started doing it, all the sort of signposts were already there. We already had like classic fanzines like Slash or Ripper or Forced Exposure, and we all or Glenn Friedman's My Rules, and bands had already begun touring. And in Boston, we already had a great scene to begin with. So it was just sort of for me it was a way of being a part of it. It's simple, like. If you're not going to start a band, start a zine, put on shows. I mean, it's kind of just what you did, and so the zine sort of ran 6 years. I did 20 issues, and I guess it was resonant enough, for the next 25 years later, where people would come up to me and be like, hey, I really love that issue with the Bad Brains on the cover, or I love that issue with Sam Hain on the cover, or the Cro-Mags on the cover. And it was sort of one of those things I was just like, yeah, cool, great, done. And it hit a point where I was approached by a record label in Boston called Bridge 9. And it's a great Boston hardcore label, and it's literally from where I grew up. Like, my sister lives a mile away. My parents live 3 miles away, and literally, the owner is a guy named Chris Wren. He's like, I'd really like to do a book version of your zine. I'm like, okay. So we started sending stuff back and forth, and we started sketching out a basic idea for what it was going to be. And at first the idea was like, oh well, maybe we'll collect all 20 issues. Well, nobody should have to read that. Like, it's just too much. And we decided to sort of do a greatest hits of the 20 issues. And then Chris, who was doing another book based around a New York fanzine called Schism, sort of got hit with a cease and desist by a photographer who contributed photos to the Schism book. So the project sort of languished for a few years. there were a couple of false starts. Revelation Records in Huntington Beach, who, are old friends of mine and a really great, great and historically important label, were interested in doing a book version, and I needed a layout and design guy because I can't do that. So it sort of sat for another year or so. I reached out to Chris again at a certain point when I was like looking at thousands of photographs. I guess I'm kind of a hoarder. like not that bad. Like it's
Organized hoarder.
I have a store. Well, yeah, I have a storage space. And I called up. I was kind of looking at the stuff, going, this can either sit in my storage space, or we can actually see if there's a book here. So I called Chris up and he was like, yeah, let's get to it. So basically we were like, yeah, it'll be 130, 140 pages, sort of greatest hits, maybe some essays and all that. And really that's kind of when the journey began, because it didn't turn into that book at the end. What we said was going to take 6, 7, 8 months, 3.5 years. But the great part of that was, in addition to the stuff I had, speaking to what we were talking about before, I reached out to just old friends, people from the community, and I had a lot of stuff. Other people, including a guy named Al Quint, who's sort of a legendary sort of fanzine guy who did a zine called Suburban Voice. He helped me out a little bit, and literally as I reached out, just to old friends, stuff started really coming in. So all of a sudden, I have like, there's the interviews that we're gonna sort of configure, the book around. But here's essays I was writing. I started interviewing people for sort of like then and now commentary. And as time went on, and there were some people who were like immediate to get in. They're like, I hit up Henry Rollins, who took all of 90 minutes to get back to me. Like it was like literally like, did I catch you on a slow day? And then there's people who I've known for very, very closely for years, who took upwards of like 2.5 years to get. I mean, and then these are people like I talk to regularly.
We had that experience too.
Yeah.
You just never. And then I don't know if you had this experience, but since the book has come out, people have sent more stuff.
Oh yeah.
Like where were you 6 years ago?
Like
We have enough for the second issue already.
Well, it was great. It was like at the end of things for me, literally, I'm done, and all of a sudden, like, there's a Boston area photographer named Bruce Rhodes who he was sort of the Glenn Friedman of the Boston scene, and he documented a lot of the early to sort of mid '80s hardcore shows, and all of a sudden we're done with the book, and I get this call, "Hey, it's Bruce Rhodes." I'm like, where the hell have you been? So I think this way. I think we're all hoping for second editions of our books.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Do you all have questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm curious. I mean, it's an amazing book to look through, and it's so interesting that the punk scene, like a really notable punk scene, grew out of Washington D.C., which is still like the whole notion of all that.
Yeah.
Is that punk scene still sort of alive, for lack of a better word? Has it moved to a different location?
Yeah. There's still a thriving scene. I mean, I think like, as new generations come up, they kind of reconfigure the scene the way that they need to. But we're on the third or fourth wave of hardcore in DC.
Fifth or sixth.
I think what's interesting that's happened in DC is the Discord Records, which was centered around that first sort of group of DC guys. For the longest time they were putting out sort of this person's next band, or like Guy from Rites of Spring, he's in Fugazi. Mark Sullivan, who was in the Teen Idols. Here's the Kingface record. Sean Brown, who was in Dag Nasty. Here's a Swiz record. And, I think what's happened in DC that's really interesting is that whole sort of, the generations of sort of founding fathers have sort of petered out. Mm-hmm. And,
new people have.
Yeah, new people
They also gave us a template, a DIY template. I mean, Discord Records was made up of a few friends who were like gluing together 7-inch covers themselves and distributing things themselves, and that taught us that we could do things ourselves too. We can do our own cut and paste fanzines and give them out at shows or book shows, being teenagers not really knowing what we were doing. So they created a template that's been copied over and over, not just in DC but worldwide.
Worldwide, and I think it's still, you still see fanzines.
Yeah.
You still see bands, doing it the same way, which is, I've been working for record companies for the past 23 years, and to me that's sort of like rock has almost like become a DIY movement. And bands have to sort of, part of, I think, a band, being successful is actually like learning the ropes and doing it themselves.
Yeah, you noticed that about a band, right?
Yeah.
When they've taken initiative.
Yeah, and that's, to me, that way of doing things really goes back to those sort of early days.
Yeah.
I was very happy to see you all bring in your punk t-shirts. So I was wondering if you would each say a word about your t-shirt.
This says "Ride Fast, Live Slow," and it's a Tim Barry shirt. I don't know who's familiar with Tim Barry, but he used to sing for a band called Avail, which I booked at Safari Club, and now he has a solo acoustic folk career. And so this is one of his shirts. So it's kind of homage. He's a train hopper. Ride fast, live slow. Ride the trains, but live life at a nice slow pace where you can enjoy things. So I'm a big fan of his work.
And this was my band in DC.
Zinesters.
Kind of a new school band, like we were around in 2012.
Yeah.
So part of that newer generation. And they're still going, even though I had to move back to California.
Darn.
And this SSD stands for SSD Control, who were a band that were insanely significant in my life. They were Boston's band. They were the band that sort of, they had a straight, well actually they were very certain, the founding member of the band was a guy named Al Baril, who was very close with actually, Ian MacKay and some of the original DC guys.
Yeah.
And, DC had the phenomenon of straight edge. And, we living in Boston, we had, we're from a colder, sort of more hard scrabble environment. We had to step that up. And there's great legends about like SSD Control's playing. They're slapping beers out of people's hands. They're going through clubs with flashlights, Some of that was true, a lot of that wasn't.
Like militant edge.
But, for me, Al and SSD created the Boston scene. And that, and when I first heard they had a record in 1980, they came out in 1982 called "The Kids Will Have Their Say," and when I heard that record, it was empowering. It was literally, you can do this. You can express yourself. You can recreate and reshape your world. And if there was ever something that was like just important and significant to my life, to my scene. And I think to music itself, to music itself, trickling out to now, SSD was sort of the foundation in Boston.
Good question.
Is there an interview that stands out when you're working on your book? Like anything interesting?
Some funny ones.
Any specific? A lot of our interviews actually got lost because we had a computer that we had a B&E.
We did.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did have a computer stolen with some stuff that wasn't backed up.
We had great times.
We had to start over at some point.
Like our first interview was actually the guys from rival schools. They were playing in DC.
Walter Schreifels, who'd been in Gorilla Biscuits. And we had an extensive
and
interview.
Sammy,
with him.
who's in Gorilla Biscuits,
Yeah.
Ethiopian, and all those bands. So we were just like, we should go and interview these guys because they were like one of the first big shows at the Safari Club, and so that was like
we
our
have partial interviews left.
Yeah, but I thought that was exciting just because it kind of
Yeah.
set the pace and the energy of like getting this book started, and
Yeah,
it was fun.
Yeah, we just kind of interviewed people backstage and in alleys and in after shows as much as we could over the years.
A question for Mike. First of all, I guess I'm probably the only person who saw apology play live.
Oh my!
Mike was a singer of a band called Apology. I was a big Gitter fan, so I probably started reading
I'll take that.
Black when I was like 12 or 13.
Oh, awesome.
Thank you.
And it was just like you're saying about SSD, I really enjoyed the writing and reading it, everything. You realize you could do it yourself.
Thank you.
And it was around this time I started going to shows, so it encouraged me to do that. It was kind of a scary thing, at first. So I just wanted to ask, like you said, you don't do layout and stuff yourself. Just about the actual fanzine, like how did you do it, physically, and what kind of, do you remember like what the distribution was generally, stuff like that?
I mean, as far as the layout, it was figured out, which means cut and paste. In the early issues, which we reprint a lot of like double-page spreads. You see how raw and how roughshod that was, and it was just a process of figuring out like, shrink typewriter font. Like, how do I maximize this? I'll shrink the typewriter font. It'll look cool.
Did you use the rub-on letters?
Yeah, sure did. Because people use those for flyers.
Yeah.
So it was sort of this communal knowledge.
Yeah.
But I mean, we also, like, I can halftone photographs and they won't look like black blobs. That's cool. And it just, as time sort of went on, you just sort of like perfected your rubber cement, rub-on letters, shrunken typewriter font, whatever looked cool. I'm sorry, what your second question was?
Well, like, do you remember about distribution?
Oh, sure. Initially, and again, this harkens back to the notion of community. My friend Al Quint, who had a zine called Suburban Punk, which later became Suburban Voice, he was selling his zine at local record stores on consignment, which means you brought some in, they'd sell them, they'd take their little cut, they'd pay you the money. I mean, I was just happy to have them like in Newbury Comics, in the Salem Record Exchange, and luckily at the time there was also a really amazing independent distribution network. So as the zine grew, I mean, I was also selling zines at shows, and there's a very funny thing I remember at the very first show. The very first issue. The very first issue, I got out in time for a Dead Kennedy show in Waltham, Mass. As it turns out, one of the people who bought it was a guy from that area, named who's now known as Rob Zombie. And ultimately, like speaking of DIY. That's a band that sort of would advertise in my zine, recorded and released their own records, and sort of grew into what they did. But yeah, as time went by, like distributors like Rough Trade, Systematic, Mordam, which were all thriving sort of the bloodline of the underground. They would carry zines. And, so I would send 200 here, 300 there, 150 there. And there were also record stores that would carry zines. And, like most importantly out here, there was a store in Long Beach called Zed's. And Zed's was like sort of the key store, for basically Southern, in my mind at least, for Southern California. And, in tons of independent, records, just, everything that was sort of happening in this world at that time sort of passed through there. And I still hear a lot of people coming back to me going, oh, I picked up that issue at Zed's, more often than not. And I've basically developed friendships with people, because of things like that. And that's how we sort of communicated and got involved with each other.
Question, actually for everyone. So you have like a hope or like a purpose for telling stories, I guess, for all three of you. Like you guys have Venue and then Mike has his zine. So what would be your hope or purpose of doing stories from the 80s? Or how would you like to see them trickle into today's DIY culture?
Well, hopefully it does inspire people to take the reins and realize they can do it themselves. Originally, it just started as something that we wanted to do for our community. We wanted to document a space and a time that meant a lot to us and our friends. And if that just meant a yearbook for 20 people, then that's what it was. But ultimately, hopefully, if it inspires the next generation to take things into their own hands, that's awesome too.
Yeah, I mean, it's that, and also some of this stuff like just needs to be preserved. We're also talking about a culture that's now 25, 30 years old, and having that sort of documentation and having that sort of like, here's at least one sort of impression of how it was, and maybe you'll get something out of it. Maybe you'll be inspired by it. Maybe you'll take maybe somebody will take the lessons of that and carry it into their own lives and reshape their own world.
Yeah, and something I said in the introduction was, what did I say? That what inspired us was that a lot of the stories that were coming out ended in '85, and so we really didn't see ourselves represented. And it's great that that stuff is preserved, and it needs to be. But there was something that came after, so it was important for us just to be a part of the worldwide conversation of punk rock. We're just one of many books on the shelves now, but we wanted to have that little voice.
And actually, what's really interesting is my book sort of dovetails into your book. Like I ended my thing around 1988.
Yeah.
And that's when
we pick up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a little teeny bit of overlap, I think, in our books, but it spans 15 years.
And it's interesting because there's other books that sort of harken back, like the Touch and Go, Tesco V's Touch and Go book, American Hardcore. We got for LA we got the Neutron Bomb.
Yeah. Please Kill Me.
Yeah, Please Kill Me.
Yeah.
Or the books from the two main members of the Cro-Mags. All sort of like tells, all sort of like start encompassing the story, and it's pretty interesting. It's just cool now. Now to go, okay, everybody's starting to tell the story. Because no one person can tell it.
And that story contradicts itself all the time.
Yeah. And I kind of love that.
And that's the beauty of it.
In our book, it's an oral history, so we just interviewed people. We didn't write anything. I'm not a writer. So I
wrote an introduction.
So we just interviewed a bunch of people, and people would tell one story, and then the next guy would tell
the same story a different way, and remember it differently.
And we wouldn't correct.
That.
We wouldn't correct it. We would just put both in, and you decide.
Yeah. Memory's tricky.
Yep.
Any last questions? Whoever asks a question wins a fanzine. Bonnie.
I wanted to ask Shawna to talk about women in the scene.
Women in the scene. Well, there weren't many when I was going to shows, but there were some, and especially in the early years of Discord, there were bands like Fire Party, Amy Pickering, there were people like Cynthia Connolly documenting the scene. So I did have some elders, so to speak, to look up to, but in the hardcore scene it was mostly male-dominated scene. But my best friend Pam and I were the ones booking the shows in DC at this time, so I did have a girlfriend that I experienced all of this with and built this community in this club with. Before I met her, actually, when I was in high school, all of my friends were boys, and I really wished for a girlfriend to go to shows with. And Toby, who I mentioned earlier, had met Pam. She had moved to Maryland from St. Louis. She had done a punk radio show at her college station, and she just moved to Maryland, and Toby introduced us, so I always say that he gave me my first girlfriend. And then, things kind of ran from there. We did a zine together, we booked shows together, and she was my pal. But.
Yeah, it's funny. Even as I was going through my book, one of my biggest criticisms of the book is probably there's not a lot of women. But there weren't a lot of women in bands at that point. Now, it's very interesting. A friend of mine pointed this out pretty recently. Yes, there are not a lot of women represented as musicians. There are a lot of women represented as photographers.
Documentarians.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that probably all but one or two of the people who contributed photos to my book are female.
Oh, interesting. And I think it is changing. Like I said, I went back to the club with Rich in '95 and was happy to see that 50% of the audience was women, which was kind of blew my mind. It was exciting. Are we ready to stop? Thank you all for coming so much.
I also have copies of a zine I did that previews my book, which will be out in November. So if you want one, just come up and grab one. If you want a zine, come up and bug me.
Thank you so much. And
Awesome.
Thank you, Skylight, for
Thank you. You're most welcome.
Thank you very much.
We're happy to
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.